Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Igor Marjanovic, and I have a great honor to serve as the Dean of the Rice School of Architecture, and also have great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, the Spring Civic Forum of the Rice Design Alliance, a public programs and outreach arm of the Rice School of Architecture. As you know, the RDA organizes many events and gatherings, but Civic Forum really is one of its oldest traditions. The very first Civic Forum was organized in 1973, and it focused on the Buffalo Bayou and the potential for the bayou to act as a public space in the city of Houston. Personally, I really like the tradition of the Civic Forum because in many ways it celebrates urbanism as a form of not only form and city building, but also as a conversation and gathering of the many viewpoints, because one of the ideas behind the Civic Forum is that it brings architects of different backgrounds, but also people and stakeholders interested in urbanism more broadly. I do want to say a few words of thanks tonight for this particular event. First, to all of the faculty and staff of the Rice Design Alliance and Rice School of Architecture. I want to thank them for planning and executing this particular event. If you missed my earlier announcement, we also can provide AIA continuing education credits, and Carla Haskins, who is here in the audience, can help you set that up. She's right there on the right-hand side, and her email is carlah@rice.edu. I also want to thank all of the RDA members, enthusiasts, and officers for all of their support and participation in all of the events at the RDA, both this year and throughout the decades of RDA's history. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight, for joining us, not on campus, but off campus in this really beautiful facility, and for participating in this conversation today. And in particular, I would like to welcome the admitted graduate students of the Rice School of Architecture who are here today as a part of their open house, checking out Rice and hopefully joining us in the fall as incoming graduate students. Finally, one more word of thanks is to my colleague, Associate Professor Troy Schaum, who contributed much leadership and vision for this year's programming for the Rice Design Alliance in curating the theme of the programs for this year under the umbrella of Texas is Urban, celebrating the current state and the history of Texas cities as places of urbanity, pluralism, and cosmopolitanism, in addition to their particular local conditions over here. Sometimes, when we look at Texas from the outside, we see it as maybe a rural state, a land of cowboys, and so on, but actually it's a state of many large cities, in particular, both urban cultures, but also urban conditions and issues that are indicative of issues elsewhere around the world. Troy, as I said, is an associate professor of architecture at Rice, and also a principal of his firm, Schaum Shi, which is an award-winning practice that looks at city and urbanism from the scale of the building, both in terms of building design and also design of the spaces in between the buildings. I could not think of a better moderator for our event tonight, so please join me in welcoming Troy Schaum to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks. Cool. Thank you, Igor. We got some applause right at the beginning before we've even done anything. All right. So yeah, thank you, Igor, and thank you all for joining us. For this is the second Civic Forum that, as Igor mentioned, is capping a year of events celebrating the Rice Design Alliance's 50 years of looking closely at the built environment of Houston, and by extension, the phenomena of the Texas city. The spirit is captured in our theme, Texas is Urban, is one that the founders of the Rice Design Alliance, many of whom are here in this room, certainly acknowledged and advocated in their work together in the 1970s. The phenomena of growth, diversity, and change shapes the life of our cities and has only accelerated under the organization's watch. In our first Civic Forum session in the fall, we explored both the deep and recent histories of urban Texas. This project in conversation with urban historians from across the state. We were able to reflect, at least in part, on the question, what is the Texas urban? How has it appeared historically? How do we see it now? In what ways can we see this collective project through our region's unique social, cultural, and material histories and challenges? We saw articulated in that work that the project of the Texas city has been a motivating force long before the founding of Houston. In our last session, we saw this through the labor and spatial practices on the banks of the Trinity River and the way they propelled the growth of both Dallas, Texas skyscrapers and the city's social inequalities. We saw the surprising cosmopolitanism embodied in the brutalist architecture of 1960s Tyler, Texas. We looked at policing of adobe construction in 1960s San Antonio, and the legacies of Houston and Rice as a site for studying the paradigmatic city, the paradigmatic post-war city, and for theorization that spanned the life of the Rice Design Alliance, perhaps best exemplified by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's Learning from Westheimer Studio, presented by Michael Kubo, that was done at Rice in the late 1960s. That studio was left out of the duo's seminal text because, according to Kubo's research, Houston was too complicated. In this session, we invited a group of designers from around the world and here in Texas who are currently working on making the urban spaces of Texas. This session is concerned with how is Texas urban? How to design and make the collective project of the city in this famously laissez-faire region, with projects built one at a time, authored by teams of designers. Probably a lot of those designers are in this very room. The work we will look at today is invested in constructing public realms that emerge outside the traditional structures of city planning departments, in a way that feels perhaps not necessarily ideal, but important in our moment and place. They are sponsored by private developers, quasi-governmental agencies, educational institutions, and other types of collectives. Like the cities in Texas, they are situated they are influenced simultaneously by the hyper-specific local dynamics and the broad planetary ecologies in which our region is embedded. I've invited these designers and architects to think and discuss their work in the spirit of the breadth reflected in the Rice Design Alliance's mission across disciplines, distance, and scales. And I'm going to introduce all of our speakers now so that the actual program itself can flow a little bit more smoothly. So we're joined by Stephen Mueller. Stephen Mueller is an associate professor at Texas Tech University and founding director of research at POST Project for Operative Spatial Technologies. Mueller is a registered architect and also a founding partner of Agency, a design and research practicing leveraging both spatial design and spatial information to counteract nascent forms of global and urban inequality. Mueller is a recipient of numerous awards, including the 2021 Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the 2018 Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, the 2010-2011 Rome Prize in Architecture from the American Academy in Rome. Mueller's work has been exhibited widely, including at the Venice Biennale, the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennale, Storefront for Art and Architecture, etc. Mueller's work has also been published widely, including his most recent co-authored book, Fronts, Military Urbanisms and the Developing World, from 2020 in Architecture, Research, and Design Press. Jeanette Kuo is also visiting us. Jeanette Kuo is a co-founding partner of Carmack Kuo, based in Zurich, and a professor of architecture and construction at TU Munich. Currently, she holds the Cullinan Visiting Chair at Rice Architecture, where she is teaching advanced design research studio. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from UC Berkeley, a Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design, and a Master of Advanced Studies from the ETH in Zurich. I was almost going to read the whole name of the ETH in German, but I decided to skip that. In 2006, I can get Rachel up here. In 2006, she was the recipient of the competitive Maybeck Teaching Fellowship at UC Berkeley. Since then, she has taught at MIT, Harvard GSD, and of course here at Rice. She established in 2010 with Unal Carmack, her firm Carmack Kuo, and has focused on the intersection of spatial concepts with constructive technologies to approach architecture in its fundamental sources. The office works on projects of a range of scales, from spatial installations and exhibitions to complex cultural projects, and has been published in numerous international journals, including Architectes, Werk, Bau und Wohnen, Casabella, Architectural Review. In 2018, they were featured in a monograph, El Croquis, which some of you might have heard of. But projects include the International Sports and Sciences Institute at the University of Lausanne, the Weiden Secondary School, and the Augusta Rauische Architectural Center in Baselland. A project that was awarded the Wholesome Prize for Sustainable Construction in 2017. They're also, of course, currently working on the new Kennedy Hall building for the extension of Rice School of Architecture. Brandy Lockett is here, is the urban design lead for Houston Metro's Planning, Engineering, and Construction Urban Design Branch, a people-first division focused on transforming transit environments and developing best practice transit design standards, including transit environment planning catalog, Houston Metro's first urban design manual since 1989. Brandy Lockett's passion for urban design inspires planning and development projects and brings out vibrant opportunities in unlikely places. Her projects focus on envisioning underperforming and overlooked spaces into environments that help revitalize land and beauty, sustainability, and social well-being. In collaboration, she provides design strategies driven by public life data to implement and maintain projects in aesthetic need over time. Jason Long is a partner at OMA who leads the New York office and diverse portfolio in the Americas. Since joining the firm in 2003, Jason has brought a research-driven interdisciplinary approach to a wide range of OMA's projects internationally. Several projects take a creative approach to adaptive reuse and preservation, including one that we're all quite familiar with in this room, Post Houston, the transformation of the former post office, the Barbara Jordan post office downtown, the reimagination of Jersey City's historic Pathside building into Central Pompidou times Jersey City, the Lantern, the conversion of a former commercial bakery into a community arts hub in Detroit. Jason also leads projects in Washington, D.C. That provide an innovative approach to recreation, public health, and equitable development at varying scales, a streetscape design in Washington, D.C.'s Convention Center District, 11th Street Bridge connecting disparate communities on either side of the Anacostia River, and a master plan for RFK campus. So that's our format for tonight. We're going to have 4 individual presentations from our guests illustrious guests that hopefully I captured in their bios. And then we'll have a short Q&A after. It should be about an hour program for the presentations with a short Q&A. So we'll start with Brandy Lockett from Metro, and look forward to sharing this with all of you.
Hi, everybody. This is an indoor raincoat, so no fashion people coming for me after the presentation. My name is Brandy Lockett. It's really nice to be here with you guys tonight. Let's see. Thank you, Troy and Igor, for the kind invitation to speak about urbanism and the importance of speaking on urbanism and acknowledging locally and recognizing nationally and globally Texas as an urban place. If I could get the I think that's me. Let's see. Okay, great. My first step as an urban designer is the prioritizing people, to fully understand and appreciate and document site and context, getting to know people in place, understanding the history and planning of the development of an area. I follow a rule of thumb that the more I understand a city's and development and a state's development history and acknowledging its current state, that the better I can address and design for current and future needs. And in my practice, I try my best to apply these key urban design principles to influence change and how we design transit in Houston. I've been practicing urban design for just over 16 years. I started in the private sector in architecture and urban design, and I just fell in love with the practice from the moment I read my program's curriculum. So you guys who are students in grad school, if you're ever interested in understanding places and prioritizing people in public spaces, please consider looking more into the direction and the principles of urban design and applying them into whatever design practice you go into. So when I started drafting what I would say tonight, I thought it would be nice to revisit my grad school's program description and see if I could recognize any key words that took my attention to sturdy urbanism. And when I went to the new program's description, when it came up, I was a little disappointed because, let's see, point at the light. Don't turn the light off. Let's see. Before I point it this way, okay, no, it's too far. How do we go back, Carla? I think I went too far. Is there a way to go back? Great, thank you. So when I went to, I was a little disappointed because when I first went to my program's description, language was found. It was all based in people and why understanding people is so important to the design of great places in any environment. And on the new program site, I read the curriculum and then did a page search for the word people. And I found the word people, but it was to list the program's director. And it was just archibabble, archibabble, archibabble. And I learned that term from a Rice alum. I always find a way to put Heather Rowell on display, but that's exactly what I found on my new grad school's page. You know, when I first started getting to urbanism, I was so encaptured by this design practice that just brought in people into the framework of architecture and development and all things that had to do with creating our cities. And I just didn't find that in the current, and I'm not gonna put my school on blast, that's why I hope no one recognizes that text from my school. So, so I don't know what made it. I don't know if it makes me old-fashioned or if 16 years is just too long from being away from academia. But I do believe that there is a formula to the practice of urban design, and no matter how it evolves, the practice of urban design, that formula. That to be applied to cities and development, the success of that practice is the application starting with understanding people. And I don't believe that changes. So that was my little vent and passion on urban design. Now I'm gonna bring that frustration to my own agency. I hope this is a safe space. No one's from the city of Houston or TxDOT or Metro. I invited some of my colleagues, but Troy, we're filming this, right? Okay, it's not live streaming. Perfect. Okay, so I invited, so hopefully they won't get here. I love that I went first. So, again, this is gonna be a problem, you guys. Cut into my 15 minutes. I did not press off. Okay, sir, I think, can you, yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so as we started to draft and organize we're in urban design phase. No, let me go back. So when I first moved to Houston, it was about 10 days after Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, and I started my position at Metro on September 11th, 2017, and I hit the ground running ready when I moved to Houston. I mean, Houston is an urban designer's ideal workplace. Sustainability challenges across the board. I'm thinking when I get here, there'll be so many conversations on water challenges. You know, I wouldn't be able to keep up with them. That didn't exactly happen. So I had to take a huge step back, and one of my colleagues, who was an incredible planner, said to me, Brandy, you need to lower your expectations. And I don't know exactly what my expectations were with transit and the agency of Metro, but I did acknowledge that at some point, you know, the Metro leadership realized bringing in urban design would be a benefit to the agency, and that there was an honesty of we don't have a plan, but we do know we need change in the look and feel of our spaces. And that was enough for me to fight for urban design to be truly integrated within an extremely outdated planning, engineering, and construction and maintenance process. And so Okay, great. So as we started to organize where an urban design phase would work within an existing planning, engineering, construction process, where public engagement is executed through planning, but how does the data from planning get applied to design. And then in design is performed through engineering, and after construction, there's no ongoing follow-through of measurement of project performance. So to say the least, that there was internal challenges to the existing process, and it was basically a death threat to the process of urban design. And we knew we needed to get vital knowledge from veteran practitioners to get on board and reconsider the way they implemented transit projects. So we took a huge step back and decided to focus on internal documentation, internal education, provide the case to board leaders to approve and invest in the practice area by funding the development of urban design resources. So working with agencies, through kind of looking to local agencies such as SWA, which supported the development of the Urban Design Manual, and working with great resources like Ultra Barrio that helped us develop a programming catalog. These resources would direct an urban design process to all involved with creating transportation projects of all scales, which is a great asset to our urban design method at Metro and supporting city development across the board, where all of our kind of directions are integrated through transit and transit routes. So that we would create resources that give an urban design practice really a regulatory voice in transportation and design. And due to staff limitations that we had with urban design, we would support the review of project plans when available. So it was very important for us to have a framework of, tools and kind of regulatory documents that would support us working with engineers, working with people that were outside of understanding how architecture and urban design and placemaking could support the envisioning and bringing on stakeholders to envisioning our places, our transit spaces in different ways. And what I love so much about our documents too is that, they modularly illustrate what a public space can be. And that was a trade-off of function until we could get the document resources and staff support to support project implementation at a high level. And so we knew our colleagues wanted to construct better transit projects. The other challenge we had in creating an urban design practice area within the transit agency was allowing room for change to understand how we work. And so there was much fear that change would impact, the way we work. How we work is impacting how we work and what we're most familiar with implementing transit projects. And so I do recognize that in many questions that I had in understanding the city of Houston and in Texas, this is the third-ish, I know it's still the fourth, but largest city in the nation, and I couldn't understand the hesitation of changing a process to achieve better project results and the fear of bringing high-frequency transit to our streets. This city, it's not going to stop growing. Why is it so hard to change the culture of how we see transit in Texas? For an agency, how do we get people to understand that transit is more than a mobility service, but a supplement to city development? And how do we change the interest in transit, change the culture of using transit, prioritize public transit? And I think that recognizing Texas as an urban place that is, of course, it's beyond question. You don't have to accept that it's an urban place, but because it's here. And what I love so much about this city, is what is so unique to Metro is that Metro services routes through urban, suburban, and rural contexts, right in the city's core. It's completely wonderful, and I think that is something that we need to amplify through our designs, showcasing how, our transit system kind of really connects all of these different types of environments. So I kind of get when people have mixed feelings about wanting to categorize Texas as an urban environment. And the realities of neighboring communities in Houston can be so different, of course. I think we've all experienced that if you live here and if you haven't lived here. It's one of our great realities in the city of Houston. Maybe there's a fourth typology that comes out from this forum for Texas, because even with the argument Texas is complicated and uniquely complex in identity, which is again the perfect place for a practice of urban design, I did think that I needed my colleagues working at Metro to understand that we are an urban dense place and could not continue to design transit infrastructure as independent facilities, and that's true. But how I wish I started was understanding their challenges and understanding the barriers that inhibit them from making their role in creating better projects better. Asking questions to highlight the benefit of their role in creating good transit, with the goal of transit being designed as public spaces of our streets and not just on our streets. Designing them as iconic city markers. So it's a challenge to acknowledge a place as an environment opposite to how we independently identify its character. And that is what's so great about the practice of urban design. That you can bring out unique characteristics of a place existing or new. And in my one critique of the practice, it's the name itself, that this is a practice designed to enhance the unique characteristics of any place, how local integrity can be maintained but still provide city-scale infrastructure to keep dense places operating and supported. Not a practice that takes away, but amplifies the character and identity of places. And it was not until I came to Houston that I would talk about the great process of communities. But the moment I said urban design, there was a hesitation. We don't want sidewalks, we don't want tall mixed buildings, but we do want better access and stronger communities. So if there is a term that comes from this form, and in identifying Houston's context, I'm available. If we want to rethink a term specifically for Texas that includes urban, suburban, and rural connections. But I have learned from ongoing experiences that acknowledgement with work leads to change. And that does not mean that you are going to get the support you need to create that change, but it is hope and impact, and I'll take that fight and continue that fight for implementing urbanism throughout our work. The importance of acknowledging and recognizing Texas as an urban place speaks directly to combating the questions of Texas, of transit culture and influence. I think these are the conversations that really impact and change the culture of the way we see our urban infrastructure throughout our region. And these conversations spark the knowledge of the way we understand and see our places and inspire nationally and globally conversations of what the identity of our communities and our cities are. But I think first internally, as an agency for Metro, we must take accountability in taking transit seriously. We were recently awarded $150 million for University Corridor for bus rapid transit. And, this is having a little mixed feelings about this, but we did, we dropped the ball on a no-brainer, what should have been an exciting public engagement process with communities. And so we're right now in this moment where we don't know if we're gonna miss an FTA deadline because of the lack of public engagement. A seamless urban design process would have supported that effort, really integrated, the community's needs, their wants, and their priorities within a very clear, transparent design process. And it's important, and it's kind of like, I'm not happy that that happened, but it did allow them to see that it was needed and that more of me is needed within the transit agency. So it was kind of like a win-win, not a win-win, a win, not win, I'm not sure. But it helped my argument. And so now, I've got, engineers and, my direct really wanting to improve the practice area of urban design with the agency. But when communities stand up and say, we don't want transit, we don't want what you're proposing, you have no choice but to rethink and acknowledge what we're not providing as an inclusive design. And lastly, so 3 hours ago, I gave a presentation to a community for the University Corridor, a major project, 25 miles of bus rapid transit. And we called it Better Access, Stronger Communities. And I've been at Metro for 5 years. And tonight was the first time the executive vice president and my direct acknowledged the role of urban design as a real project phase. So I took that as a silent win for design. It's not all uphill. Things will quiet down and meetings will go on. But I do think internally that agency disciplines are starting to recognize the role of urban design and transit, and design not being an independent engineering phase. And that's a great sign of culture change in transit throughout through an urban design process. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Jason Long. I'm a partner with OMA, and thank you all for being with us here tonight, and thank you for inviting me. Let's see if, oh, that is an interesting trick. Yeah, did you figure out the secret to this thing? Amazing. Backwards works. Forwards, not so much. Next. Okay, here we go. That's me. Next. I try to go kind of quickly. Can you, next slide, please? So mainly tonight I'm going to talk about Post Houston, the project that we completed last year on the edge of the Buffalo Bayou at downtown Houston. This is a project that we've been working on for a number of years. First, as I'll show you briefly, as an initial master plan exercise, and then finally kind of in the form that maybe some of you have been to see it. Obviously, this is a project that sits in a kind of interesting context. Next. That's weird. Okay. Anyway, in some ways, the site is quintessentially Houston in the sense that it's a juxtaposition of infrastructure, massive industry downtown, and increasingly offices downtown, and increasingly residential. Houston's kind of lack of zoning obviously often leads to radical juxtapositions. Next. With houses next to parking garages. Next. Or erotic temples next to department stores. Whoops. Oh, okay. Nope. Next. And this side is no different. I am originally from Memphis, Tennessee, but my father actually lived here since I was a child, and so I've been coming since then. Mainly for stretches of 4 to 8 weeks in the summer, kind of the worst possible time to be here, which no one really told me at the time. And so my memories as a kid were really only of freeway interchanges and incredibly hot asphalt and only in the neighborhood pool. And some parts of this image obviously recall what I remember from childhood, but others are things that I didn't really even know about hardly until we started on this project. Namely the kind of verdant territory of the Buffalo Bayou, and also the incredibly metropolitan skyline of downtown Houston. We were invited to work on this project by Lovett, a local developer, with Frank Liu and his 2 sons, and they had purchased the land a few years prior to that and were at the time the only developers who thought to actually keep the building, the big beige rectangle you see kind of in the midground here, rather than tearing it down and doing some kind of tabula rasa, God knows what, on the edge of downtown Houston. Next. This building, which is over almost 1,000 feet long and 500,000 square feet, is a former post office warehouse and sorting facility, at the time called the Barbara Jordan Post Office, before it shut down. Here you're looking towards the south over the building towards downtown. Obviously the building is a kind of radical contrast to the high rises of downtown. Next. But it's also a contrast of pavement. Next. And the green of the bayou. And that green, I think, as I mentioned, was a little bit of a shock to me because it stands so much in contrast to the concrete that you think of, or that I certainly thought of when I thought of Houston, and pointed towards its real nature as a kind of tropical place. Next. The bayou stretches, of course, from downtown to Memorial Park and beyond. My father lives now kind of over in Memorial, and it's even over there. We had the pleasure, I guess, of working on 2 projects on the bayou right around the same time, one Post and the other the Ismaili Center, which we lost, so just to cut into any suspense. So I won't talk about it much, but I thought I'd show it briefly. Next. So this was the competition we entered, of course, for the Ismaili Center that you may know that's being built on the site, maybe now. We tried to make something that we felt was both, well, appropriate for the type of use that it was going to be, but also appropriate to Texas, if only because we throw little cowboys into this graphic. Next. But it's also a project that I think is also quintessentially Houston in the way that it sits within a kind of radical juxtaposition of different types. So from parking structure to large residential but not so high-rise building, to the bayou itself and the flood potential that defines the kind of northern edge of the site. And our scheme for the building tried to intertwine two walls in a way that could address all of these different, very complicated faces in ways that could satisfy the needs of, for example, pointing towards Mecca, but also navigate the public and private nature of the institution. Next. So really a kind of intertwined set of walls that on the one hand defines certain private moments within the site, but also welcomes the public in to the institution and tries to utilize the portions of the site that are more sensitive in nature, given the flooding, as a new public space on the edge of the bayou. Next. So here you're looking north. Next. And here over to downtown, where we actually did manage to do a project. Next. Next. Okay, so back to post. Here you see the building kind of in its, well, not quite current, but nearly finished state, maybe early 2021. Next. As I mentioned, the building had formerly been a huge sorting facility for mail. Next. And when we got to it, it was empty, but an endless field of columns on the inside. That was a bit of a daunting thing to try to figure out how to make sense of. Next. Not to mention just the pure sheer scale of this 1,000-foot long facade. Next. So our initial instinct was actually to try to chop the building up into more digestible pieces, literally, extending the grid of the city both from downtown but also to the west into the site. Next. So trying to bring Washington Avenue over and cutting into the building to sever it from the office tower portion that's on the south side, and also extending Congress up to divide the building. Next. So this is how it is, we found it. Next. And this is what we thought initially we would do. So again, cutting Washington through in order to create a separation and a new facade for the building on the south side, and then extending Congress up and dividing the building into an smaller east portion and then a larger west portion. We weren't able to follow through on this for a number of reasons, but the main one was that we started to, or the developer started to see tax credit financing as an important part of how to make the whole project come together financially. And that meant that we suddenly became very limited in what we could do and what we could touch, and we certainly couldn't start chopping pieces off of the building or cutting it into two big pieces. In a way, in the end, I think that was a blessing, both because it forced us to grapple more with the building as it was, and also because it forced us to take advantage of the sheer scale of it, which is maybe its primary unique asset. Next. So instead of trying to cut the building into discrete volumes, next, we treated it more like a kind of farmland that we could plow into. Next. So we cut a series of atriums into the building to try to open it up and bring this, in a way, view of downtown deeper into the building and bring light into the building, and also divide it up into more understandable components. Next. So inserting 3 atriums and then a performance space that you could say is the biggest atrium of all into the building, and then placing distinctive stairs within each of them in order to give them an architectural identity, but also to frame the various programs within them. So of course this idea of creating atriums in a big building and putting circulation or interesting programs in it isn't the most novel thing anyone ever did. Next. It's something that's been done many times. This is the Galleria, maybe Houston's most famous mall. Next. And of course, these kinds of spaces are not unique to malls, and there are also places where people can really come together, especially in a climate like Houston. Next. And also places where, again, Galleria, health and wellness can even be part of the building, even in surprising ways. Next. In our case, we tried to make the building in a way more vehemently public by utilizing the stairs within each of the spaces to try to draw people up from the city and also potentially the bayou directly onto the roof that could become a new public space in the city. Next. And we tried to make each of the stairs in a way that they would be dynamic ways to move up through the building, kind of instruments for connecting with people. So one is a zigzag, next, that's mirrored to make a kind of double X, next. One is a double helix of 2 stairs that's nested within the grid of the existing columns, next, next. And one is unfolded within the atrium, almost like a piece of origami. Next. Next. So each of these stairs was built within, of course, the atrium that it serves, each with a different structural system and a different materiality. So here, the X stair in the so-called theater atrium is made of steel box beams that integrate into the existing structure. Next. Kind of branching between either side. Next. And creating a set of interconnected pathways that people can move through in ways that they choose. Next. At each of the intersections, they can also be used as a sort of stage. Next. And of course, because it's a massive steel structure, they can also be used to hang things supporting other kinds of events. Next. The last stair, the furthest to the east, is the co-working stair that's actually hung from the structure that supports the roofs of each of the atriums and creates, through hanging it, both a space on top of the stair but also space under the stair. Next. It's clad with wood to create maybe a sense of warmth, but also simply a sense of difference. Next. And of course, each of the landings here is expanded out to make a sort of a meeting space that hopefully will eventually be used for a meeting. I don't think it has yet. And then in between each of the runs of stairs, you can also hang. Next. This stair, like the X, can also be used for events or even as a stage for performances. Next. Next. And underneath the stair, maybe we create a space where you can actually get away from the crowd in the shadow of the pedals of the stair, you could say. Next. In between these 2 stairs is the food hall, the most active space in the building right now, that we imagine to be a kind of night market of sorts with a series of kiosks that are arranged from small to big as you move deeper into the building. Next. And in the middle of that space, there's this double helix stair that's supported by a series of 4 columns. Next. The stair itself was fabricated off-site and brought in as a series of independent aluminum elements that were all kind of fused together on site. Next. Next. And then the whole thing is lit. We only allow neon on the signage, which surprisingly they were up for, in addition to, of course, the lighting that's defining the stair itself. Next. Next. Each of these kiosks is an aluminum structure that cantilevers off a kind of central series of posts. The idea being to make a kind of halo for signage, but also a halo to give a sense of compression once you're actually sitting at the stools here at any of these bars. Next. And together, hopefully, they form a kind of landscape that you also can see from the stair as you move up. Next. The last space is the music venue, and it's the last space that we designed. You could say this is the biggest atrium of all and has the biggest stair of all. It houses up to 5,000 people. In a way, the people themselves become sort of the architecture, but next. We tried to also make the space a little bit more multi-layered than we thought was typical of such a space by doing 2 things. One, the zone furthest to the west, which, at least this will work. Okay. Oh, but you're really this is really cut off. In any case, the this zone here to the west side of a polycarbonate wall that runs north to south throughout the space, we use to house all the back of house functions, but also the main circulation up through the different levels. And then, of course, on the east side is the back of house and the main stage area. Next. So this gives us two zones, one of which could be specific, while the other satisfied the need for adaptability and flexibility within the space. Next. One could be more intimate, while the other was serving the functions of collectivity, so that you could actually escape a performance if needed. Next. And we tried to layer into both that area, but also even some of the main spaces within the performance venue, spaces where you could escape the show and kind of hang out, like almost under the bleachers at a football game. Next. So here you see the polycarbonate wall that features a kind of prominent yellow stair that can take you up. Next. And here, this blue stair that's clad in FRP, so that it can be both a dramatic element in the space, but also something that glows. Next. Providing kind of pathway lighting even during the performance. Next. And a kind of hint that there's more going on beyond it. Next. So there's a void that's cut into the so-called tribune of seating here that takes you back to a bar. Next. And a space where there's an oversized bench where you can escape the show. Next. While still being connected to it. Next. As I mentioned, we used historic tax credits for the building, which really limited in many ways what we could do, especially to the outside of the building, but even the inside, where we needed to show that all these different structures were almost could have been there when we started. Next. When we're utilizing this kind of tax credit, the goal is really to kind of follow the architectural character of the building that exists when you arrive. In our case, that was the architectural character of a blank facade, which made adding windows kind of difficult. Next. And we weren't allowed to actually do anything other than to add a series of windows that were slits in the north side of the building, creating a kind of Morse code out of what had been a series of ventilation louvers. Next. The roof of the building is maybe its greatest asset, a place where you can go and see Houston in a way that I think is kind of unique, at least in our experience. And we organized it from left to right here with a farm, what's intended to be a kind of more urban plaza-like area that's connected to the largest restaurant that's on the roof, and then a more organic garden through which you might pass until you ultimately come to the view. Next. So here, nearly complete. Next. And then here, where you can see the more garden-like component of organic forms of planters on the west side of the roof that try to create a series of meandering paths leading you ultimately both to the view, but also to the main central space where lots of different things happen. Next. From yoga with a view of downtown. Next. To, of course, in the farming at the far end. Next. We cut also a series of skylights into the roof that are each individually lit to form lanterns. Next. Next. Oh, and that's it. Thanks so much.
So, thank you, RDA, Troy, Igor, for the invitation to present tonight. So maybe I should just also advance with the next, please. I actually created a title page because I wasn't sure if there was going to be one for me, but I think, when I first had the conversation with Troy about what this evening would focus on, he was talking about, Texas is urban, and, of course, urbanity, if we think about it, is really about the idea of the collective. And in the collective, there's always the question of how you relate between the public and the private. And I think this is a topic that in Texas, or in what I know of Houston particularly, is maybe not so black and white, which also in some ways defies what our expectations are. Next. So maybe just to kind of take a step back a little bit is that I first encountered Houston, or the idea of Houston, through Lars Lerup's essay called Stem and Dross, where he, I would kind of equate his writing about Houston in the same way that Rainer Banham wrote about LA, which is really to kind of rethink the definition of what a contemporary metropolis would be. That it's not, we can't define it using the same terms that we defined the metropolis of, 200 years ago, where it's much more the kind of European model. And so to try to think about what those components are that defines the Houston experience, which in this case, for him was, of course, this kind of the mega shape, the stimulation of this mega shape of the urbanism that you see, the towers that emerge from this kind of sea, what he calls the zoohemic, which is this kind of sweaty canopy of live oaks, and then that you experience all of this through the kind of freeways that kind of snake through all of this, and of course the weather. So he paints a really, I would say, vibrant picture that's quite atmospheric of this idea of Houston that I actually was really fascinated by. I mean, I had read this article, I think in 2003 or something like that. It was probably written in the 90s. But had actually a pretty huge impression on me. And then, of course, I came to discover Houston, getting the project here at Rice University, and realized that, in fact, this picture is even more complex than he makes it out to be. This is, of course, a kind of an aerial view of it. And I really appreciated, what Brandy was talking about in the beginning of, urbanism also being about the people, is that, what I discovered coming to Houston is that it's really layered. And that experience, all of these ecologies that Lars Lerup brought together in his text, doesn't just exist as a kind of aerial view, but it exists in this kind of layering of urbanism that you experience. Also, I think Jason was hinting at that with this kind of collage or this juxtaposition of quite radically different things. And that the public and the private and the way that defines urban space really is much more complex. That very often, in fact, it's the private which is the public. And that the private spaces are these really vibrant areas that are unpretentious, that are diverse and pluralistic, and actually quite real. So next, and it cuts through a range of experiences in the city that is in some ways quite unexpected. So things from the bayou of the kind of arboretum to next, a kind of backlot barbecue in a way, which really is also in its own terms very urban, very Texan. Next. To things like the Menil, or even the Kimball in Fort Worth, that are essentially private institutions, but that provide such an amazing public service. The Menil Park, but also just the fact that you can go freely into the art galleries there, really is something that, in fact, I haven't experienced in other cities that much. And so this idea of this kind of complicitness of the public and the private, that the private becomes almost a guardian of urban space and collective space, became really interesting, especially in light of the project at Rice University. Next. So coming to Rice, I think that this in its own way, again, a kind of private institution, but really with this oasis in the middle of Houston, this very verdant, lush campus that has in its way a very defined character. I still remember a lot of our meetings with the boards and the president, where the character of this kind of history of the Rice University, with the kind of brickwork and things like that, was very important as an identity. And of course, it's something that when we build in this context becomes even more important. What do we do? How do we insert something into this without destroying, let's say, the identity and the character of the place, but actually contribute to the kind of placemaking of it? I think that, in a way, what you can see here in the image, of course, is that the campus is something which is very much defined by this kind of historical quad. The Rice building for the architecture school, I don't know if I can use this pointer. Which button is it the little, okay. Rice School of Architecture is right there. This is the Fondren Library. So technically, our site for the extension of the architecture school would be back here in the kind of greenery back there. But again, it's part of this very historical quad, which of course is a very sensitive environment. Next. So of course, the question is, how do we build in this context with a program that at the time, at the conversations that we had with the school, was really about the, let's say, the extension not being a kind of replica of the studio spaces that already exist in the building, but really about providing for other types of activities and amenities that the school currently doesn't have. So, for example, a large-scale production space or gallery spaces for them to be exhibiting the work that comes out of the school, or even visiting exhibitions that come from elsewhere. And of course, spaces that they can use for collaboration and for research that actually currently doesn't exist in the building. So this is almost a kind of complementary program, but also hints at programs that are of a much larger scale than what currently exists in the school. So this is a map of the immediate context of the school that includes, of course, all the kind of adjacent buildings and things like that, drawn in the form of, say, a Noli plan. So not a figure ground necessarily, but illustrating essentially all the collective spaces that cut through a building, or the let's say, more public areas of a building in white that you can actually connect through as a kind of network in the school. And you start to realize that the grain of the buildings that are typical of the Rice campus are really about sort of long, narrow buildings, double-loaded corridors, with very clear sort of individual rooms, but that presents a certain grain on the campus. Fondren Library, of course, being the one main exception of that. And you see here also that with the Rice School of Architecture, which itself already, so this was the original building, and this is already in itself an extension that was done by James Sterling before, that introduced this kind of collective space in the center. But besides that, all the other buildings don't have this kind of openness. And so when we started thinking about how to add into this, this context, one of the main challenges was really to think about how could we add programs that in essence want to be large-scale production types of spaces, very industrial halls, you could say, but still fit into this kind of small-scale, more linear, more kind of, let's say, broken down types of scale of this environment. Next. So one of the things that we started looking into was to think about also how we would dock onto the existing building. That was one of the criteria that for the school was important, was that there was a physical connection. And so through that physical connection, which essentially was built, or is being built, on top of the an existing arcade, stretching from the second floor, let's say, of the existing architecture school, we started creating essentially a series of bars that mimicked that roof form, that then, in that same move of the repetition, creates both an acknowledgement of the existing, let's say, roof forms or the kind of sloped roof forms of the context, but also accumulates to a kind of more industrial sawtooth roof. So it was, in a way, hinting at both the kind of scale of the interior program, but also breaking it down to fit the kind of context that's around it, and also shaping the spaces, the kind of exterior spaces that are around it. Next. And so you see here, again, this kind of extension of that roof being that first move that connects the building across, but that this kind of shifting of the bars creates pockets of outdoor spaces that could be essentially used by the school, but also that helps to break down the scale of this building. Next. And that from different vantage points, you understand also let's say, the relationship between the different buildings in different ways. Next. This is now looking from the loop road onto the building, where it becomes almost quite abstract. So it kind of flips back and forth between something which looks abstract and formal, almost like a kind of museum quality, or something that actually is maybe more industrial and large scale with this kind of sawtooth roof. But that's also something that we thought was in that sense quite appropriate for the experiences that we've had in Houston or in Texas with the urbanism that's there, is that there is this kind of juxtaposition of the formal and informal, of spaces that actually hint at kind of the languages of both. Next. In terms of the kind of organization on the interior, so the first gesture, of course, was this extension across the arcade, which creates this kind of bridge space, and that spatial, let's say, gesture is repeated across the second floor as these kind of linear organizations of kind of research and collective areas. Next. That second floor essentially creates a certain grain. So you see the different types of programs that are meant to go in there, that these are spaces that are not necessarily completely programmatically defined, but they're areas that could be used for different user groups, but that also create, let's say, opportunities for the school to kind of appropriate and think about the space in the future. So this is also, in a way, a kind of strategy to think about the kind of resilience of this building as the school evolves its pedagogy, but also in terms of how the different groups might be working together in more collaborative types of environments. So providing more sort of meeting areas and things like that that the current Anderson Hall doesn't have yet. Next. And so this is, oh, sorry, I should say second floor. First floor is in the European terms of first floor. But anyways, so it connects over, this is the plan actually of that second floor. So you see that there's two voids that essentially help to shape those linear bars, and that those programmatic sort of areas are essentially sort of mediated by zones where you can look down onto the first floor, onto the ground floor, or also where we can essentially fit in the different meeting rooms. Next. These areas, of course, we were testing it also to make sure that they fit for different types of activities that could happen within this building. So everything from smaller, sort of more informal lectures to pinups to group work that could happen there. Eventually, even studios that maybe could take some spillover into this building if there was a kind of a larger class at one point. Next. And these are just sort of interior images that we had done. Actually, this was quite early on already, a while back while we were still in pre-design and schematic design. We built these very large-scale models and to shoot the kind of interiors of it. So this you see here as the kind of work areas of the students. Next. Faculty research areas, where you can look down into also the production hall down below. Next. Here, coming over from Anderson Hall on this kind of bridge connector, looking into this kind of series of spaces. Next. And so, again, the upper level and the lower level are connected together by these kind of double height spaces, these voids, where larger scale types of, let's say, experiments and constructions could maybe take place, but that it's also a way for the school to really be conscious of all the different activities that are happening, maybe not dissimilar to, in fact, the kind of bridge moments within Anderson Hall that is already there from Sterling's extension. Next. And then on the ground floor, so on the first floor, you would see the kind of larger production hall. At the front bay of the building is the gallery space that's now actually a 2-floor gallery. And all of this, the kind of production space and the gallery, open up towards the courtyard. So part of this building, of course, is to think about, you know, how the two buildings, the existing Anderson Hall and the new building, would actually coexist within the campus. And that, in fact, what became really clear also in designing all of this is that the courtyard, which currently, you know, has already been used a lot by the school for a lot of their collective events, barbecues and graduation, a lot of things that actually happen in this courtyard, that the courtyard becomes essentially the heart of the school. And that the two buildings essentially frame a new series of exterior experiences. So you would have the courtyard that's here, the Smith Courtyard, but also a new kind of forecourt that's defined by the new building, as well as the kind of iconic facade of Sterling's building, and then also a kind of exterior space for the shop that's on the ground floor that can kind of be used also for exteriors of large-scale construction. Next. And so this is, excuse me, again, a kind of view of the shop area on the ground floor, looking towards Loop Road. Next. And this kind of juxtaposition of the two levels. So the the ground floor space of the shop that maybe could sometimes also be converted and appropriated into a kind of event space, and the upper level with the kind of research spaces, the more flexible spillover from Anderson Hall, that you see these two experiences really as woven together into a kind of collage or juxtaposition. Next. If we go back to the outside, of course, that relationship also, you know, for us what was interesting was that you see these two buildings as one on the south side, but you see it as independent buildings as well on the north side. So there's an idea about how the language of it continues over, but that it still presents itself as something quite different and something that's maybe more contemporary. Next. So the building actually faces onto the Loop Road, what you see sort of as a kind of addressing. Next. But that it also opens towards the courtyard, that there is this kind of gesture of acknowledging in a way the kind of scale of that, of the building towards the Loop Road, and also the kind of accessibility of it and the openness of it, which was something that's quite important because also in conversation with different committees within the school, that this kind of openness that actually doesn't quite exist on the Rice campus, because all the buildings are quite introverted, is in this case for the gallery, but also for the production that's happening inside, a great way really of displaying the types of activities that happen in the school. Next. So this evolved also into a kind of design, let's say, of the facade, the relationship also of the facade and the facade materiality to the existing. Next. We ended up actually using a terracotta, a kind of molded terracotta facade that's kind of like a tiled surface that essentially nods to the brick because it's terracotta is actually made with the same process, but that still has a more, let's say, contemporary identity to it. Next. So this was just a kind of a palette that we had built up together as when we first started and thinking about this in terms of the colors and the materiality that exists on campus and how we could kind of extend that language into the new building. Next. But that there is this acknowledgement in some ways of the materiality, but still a kind of crafting, let's say, of a new language that would be for this building. But again, the idea that the building is not just about a kind of a lone standing building, but it really shapes its relationship to the neighbors, and that I think already in a couple of the talks before mine was hinted at is that buildings don't stand by themselves, but really start to shape also a certain language of urbanity, if you will. I don't know if urbanity is the right word, but I think about the idea of how we come together collectively and what that means when you engage with the building, when you approach it, when you arrive, and the types of activities that could take place. Next. Again, this kind of courtyard, the Smith Courtyard, that has actually this amazing live oak in the center of it, which for this image, we had to cut back because otherwise all you would see is the live oak. But the space, in fact, becomes much more defined through the addition of this new building. Next. Oh, that's it. Thank you.
How's everybody doing? I'll try to be as quick as possible. Thanks again to Troy and to Igor and to the Design Alliance. Thank you for having me here. It's been incredible to hear all of these talks and to contribute what I can to this discussion of Texas and urbanity. I think for my talk, the question sort of reaches perhaps a larger scale, thinking about sort of the territorial scale and how urban forms in Texas are emerging to help redefine what is the global city, but also how urban forms might participate in state making or the problematization of state making within this territory. And really, I'm thinking about this in two ways in this talk. One is from the foundation that cities are increasingly autonomous political agents, that beyond the ideas of the so-called global city, there's emerged beyond these ideas of the fluidity of global commerce and the fluidity of technology and communication, sort of making the so-called global city. We've moved decisively to cities as autonomous political actors on the level of the nation state in a kind of post-Westphalian kind of paradigm. And you'll see how I'm positioning this in the work through not only sort of examples from architecture, but also sort of military theorists who have identified that our sort of paradigm of nation states is perhaps tilting again to the idea of city states. Cities being self-determined enclaves that are managed by and occupied by a host of non-state actors. And these new city forms, so I'm based in El Paso, in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez Metroplex. It's a binational urban environment. These new city forms are evidenced most clearly in environments like that and sort of trans-boundary conditions that are post-state, perhaps post-national, post-border urbanisms. And they're also threatened by efforts in military and global security to identify, simulate, dominate these sort of emerging political and physical urban paradigms. And both of these readings, importantly for this talk, sort of have traction here in Texas. So maybe we'll just get to it. So next. So Texas, as you see here, in the exists along the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S.-Mexico border is urbanizing at a high rate. Border counties in Texas have been identified over the past several censuses to have some of the largest growth rates in the country. This is an area that faces some of the largest urban challenges: desertification, resource scarcity, et cetera. And the movement here is sort of driven not only by climate migration, but all the pressures forcing human migration to the border. Next. A look at the different binational metroplexes, so these transboundary cities that exist here in Texas. We have quite a few sister cities from the westernmost part of the border where I live and work to the sort of easternmost at the Gulf. You're looking at everything from El Paso, Ciudad Juarez to Brownsville, Matamoros in this image. Next. So in our work, we look at these cities and we identify sort of shared opportunities and shared threats. Looking at them as transboundary means that they are cross-jurisdictional, that many forms of governance control, manage, and plan and design within them. Next. And that leaves that leaves several blind spots that we as designers seek to fill, operating sort of between these multiple jurisdictions, between state borders, between national borders, and between county borders, means that design needs to take on a role to increase access to information and to help visualize transboundary conditions and a kind of urbanity across borders. Next. Here we are in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez Metroplex. This is a metropolis close to 4 million people living in a shared valley separated by the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo River. And within a context like this and throughout those other border cities that you saw, there are emerging transboundary planning initiatives, regulatory bodies that exist beyond either national government, and all sorts of different forms of public health infrastructures. Next. In our work in the Research Center at Post, we work to reveal blind spots that are overlooked by some of these binational agencies and initiatives, and really highlight conditions of social and environmental injustice. Next. So for instance, looking at asymmetric exposure to ultraviolet radiation and highly pedestrianized boundaries near pedestrian international bridges where thousands of people cross to go to work or go home each day. Next. And in this image, this is taken from the Center for Spatial Research study looking at the sort of energy outage of a couple years back. You can see El Paso, Ciudad Juarez on the far left of the image as the rest of the Texas grid was failing. The El Paso, Ciudad Juarez grid kept its lights on. And part of this is just because of the division in the state grids, but I think it's a good image to kind of clarify this conception of the post-state or the post-national city. We in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, while we're within the boundaries of the state of Texas, we operate relatively independently or interdependently with other states, other counties, and other nations. Our energy grid helps supply northern Mexico and into Chihuahua. We're fed by the energy grid in New Mexico. And while I'm talking about energy here, the same could be said with our commerce, our culture. We have a particular form of resilience being a binational post-boundary kind of city that perhaps is not the same, or it's more robust than other urban environments. Next. So different political thinkers and regulatory agencies are thinking about this condition as the face of the new city. I'd highly recommend both of these books for those interested, but Paulino Ochoa Espejo as a political theorist thinking about forms of governance that are built on other forms of boundaries beyond political boundaries, things like watersheds. She talks about quite extensively in her book. And other thinkers are looking at these binational situations as conditions that actually form their own type of urban governance across topics such as public health, infrastructure planning, energy, and management. Next. And of course, architects. This is an image of Fernando Romero's plan for a binational city in our region. Architects and urban planners are of course, interested in these new urban forms to provoke new imaginaries about how people might work and live and be together in these sorts of environments. Next. So in the second part, I'll talk a little bit more about this condition of how military theory has identified emerging forms of urban environments and how they have been sort of populated throughout the state of Texas to the point that the urban in Texas is actually operating at a statewide scale. So just briefly, there are a number of documents over the last several decades where urban military planners and military theorists have sort of identified characteristics of what global security identifies as the urban. And this is a legacy that runs parallel to the legacies that we read in architecture schools and urban design schools. But it also is a series of documents and a series of observations that is almost always at the forefront of identifying sort of the next urban form. You can imagine the military is highly invested in predicting and controlling future outcomes. Next. We've written a book, my partner and I, called Fronts, Military Urbanisms in the Developing World, which looks at the instantiation of this doctrine in simulate the construction of brick and mortar urban environments that are built for the purposes exclusively of urban warfare simulation training. Next. And these environments are indicative of a larger military outlook on cities that identifies the capacity of cities that operate outside of sovereign territories or outside of nation states as particularly threatening. So the military calls these post-national cities that have been occupied by either non-state actors or violent non-state actors, calls them feral cities. And they've identified several of the cities I showed earlier in this presentation, most cities along the US-Mexico border as potentially feral, and several cities in the US as so-called feral cities during times of civil unrest. Next, so what does the military actually consider urban is an interesting question because it's not high density or high rise development, it's actually low density, what they call and pretty much what we as architects and urban planners call sprawl. So in an example, in a fictive vignette from a DoD training doctrine that was meant to forecast future urban combat scenarios, an imaginary capital city, which is composed of, quote, a haphazard sprawl of squalid squatter settlements, subsumes and connects the once distinct suburbs, described alternately as a, quote, sprawling ghetto. These fictional settlements pose a threat by forging a, quote, single unbroken megalopolis from the previously unbounded constellation of radial suburbs. Next. So how does that graft onto Texas? Well, Texas has three of the largest military training installations in the US. This is from our simulated cities database where we we geolocated and identified all of these different simulated urban environments. So I'll kind of bring you into them here to close out. Next, so the military doctrine, as I mentioned, moves from very, very small scale, very low rise ideas of what is urban to forecast and manage what it sees as a growing urban global condition where they project future resource conflict and military conflict. You can see an evolution here from everything from the scale of a room to a building to a small collection of buildings to larger and larger territorial occupations. Next. And sort of the gold standard of these installations is what's called the Combined Arms Collective Training Facility, which is here. It's a collection of 30 or so buildings of distinct typologies that are fragments of different urban forms. Next. On these sites, the sites themselves are urbanizing, so these training environments, as the military forecasts and adopts to what it believes is a growing urban global condition of resource conflict, the military training environments that emulate and simulate them are themselves sort of expanding and growing. On the right, you can see also actual cities are being appropriated in order to train for exercises in urban warfare. Next, just to look at 3 of the sites in Texas. I'll skip through these. Next. And we can just see a few in a bit closer detail before closing out. So at Fort Hood, for example, this is an example of sort of the urbanization of the training environment, the kind of growing of low-density sprawl. 2 former brick and mortar sites next were combined into a larger sort of infrastructural assemblage in order to allow for more complex training operations, including infantry, air power, and armored vehicle training to happen simultaneously. Next, this is actually one of the original and only sites to include a simulated embassy in its footprint. Years before, for instance, the Benghazi debacle at U.S. Embassy in Benghazi. Next. Here you see on one of the sites at Fort Hood the retrofitting of the simulated urban environment with the series of sort of low-rise small commercial buildings, creating the so-called urban canyon at the top left of the image. Next, this is actually a feature to convert this urban environment that's simulated in Texas to convert it to be a more accurate rendition of Sadr City in Baghdad for a National Geographic film. So these sites are also open urbanistically to not only to military trainees, they're also open to the film industry, they're open to humanitarian agencies, they're open to local police forces and even hobbyists to sort of occupy. Next. A little bit closer to where I live, this is the Fort Bliss example, where you can see this sort of instant city, right? This kind of pop-up city in the desert emerge over less than 1 year, actually, where the kind of desert scrub is struck with the urban plan of these sort of fragmented urban forms, and then later sort of occupied with the series of tank trails that you see on the right. Next. Here you see training happening among these sort of low density, sprawling urban fragments. Next. Similar story at Camp Bullis, but I'll just move forward, go next. Interesting here, operations at Camp Bullis actually simulate conditions along the US-Mexico border, including the transnational or post-national occupation of a border town by a transnational cartel. So different security forces sort of trained within a village that was dubbed Ciudad Akbar. So sort of taking a simulation from an environment in the Middle East and conflating it conflating that idea of the kind of global theater of conflict abroad with a very particular condition relative to the Texas-Mexico border town that they see as a growing political threat, geopolitical threat. Next. Next, so different typologies we cover in the book. Next. You might have to click through. These are, these are all going to animate. So these are different typologies that we cover in the book of very particular architectural forms that are found throughout these sites. If we could go to the next slide. Yes. There's examples of all of these different typologies in sites in Texas. Next. And as a last example of sort of the growing spread of this form of, let's say, projective military engagement with the urban in Texas, you might remember Operation Jade Helm from several years ago. This was a joint military maneuver operation that took place over several U.S. states. Texas, the territory of Texas for this training operation was designated as so-called hostile territory. Next, and it actually, as you see in the headline from this article in the Chronicle, the operation pretended to, quote unquote, invade several Texas cities of varying levels of sort of density and population in order to prepare for next generation warfare by the US military, right? So this includes places like College Station in San Antonio, but also many more sort of smaller towns along the kind of low density occupation of land that is Texas. Next. Thinking a bit about what this means, being cognizant of the fact of what Foucault and later Stephen Graham have termed the boomerang effect, that what we project in our military force abroad, in cities abroad, often is turned back into the domestic interior and affects our lives at home. Everything from technological forms that we've seen in the past, like surveillance, increasingly military planning that is happening in post-war reconstruction in cities abroad is being identified as advantageous in American cities as well. Next. So I'd just like to leave with this idea as sort of Texas has been home to the imagination of global security as it plays itself out in these sites, and as they apply to real-world scenarios that exist along cities in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, conditions of post-national urbanization. We can see from these sites in Texas and beyond how our cities are reflected and how our future cities might be projected and perhaps threatened through the lens of global security. Next. So thank you.
So I know everyone's been here for a little while, but we have maybe 10 or 15 minutes for a short conversation and maybe a couple questions from the audience. I think one of the things I wanted to put on the table and thank our panelists, first of all, for what a kind of amazing array of work and thought by all four of you. And as I was looking across the projects and listening to you all speak, I couldn't help but imagine, which was sort of underpinning, I think, the conversation of the RDA in the 1970s till now, which is how do we connect together the scales of like what makes the city? And looking at your presentations, we certainly saw, I think, especially in the last presentation, Stephen, from all the way from the kind of planetary scale or like the project of a satellite view of questions across like the entire southern border of the United States, through satellites, through the kind of work of Jeanette looking at the zoomorphic canopy and largest sketches of the atmospheric, and then your reimagination of the Noli plan, Jason's kind of like articulation through collage and juxtaposition of the kind of like photographs of like historic Houston and trying to think about what constituted public space as a kind of historic formation. And in Brandy's kind of like exploration through the axonometric, through rendering, through thinking about kind of like these kind of instantiations of kind of like the urban as it appears, right? And we see the urban kind of appear across scales through different modes of representation from all of you. So, I mean, my biggest question is not just one of technique, but I guess like how this way we see the city as designers can maybe be leveraged, at least provisionally here in this conversation, to like connect, I think, Brandy's kind of initial call for how do we make space in some kind of coherent collective way? How do we like investigate these kind of moments of appearance and layering that Jeanette's describing? How do we engage in some of the problems around the kind of reimagining of like possibility of buildings that may in another context be torn down that Jason's engaging? Like, how do we start to connect some of these dots together? I mean, I think we have legacies we see. We can think of the Post as a megastructure. We can understand the kind of enclave of the Rice campus and maybe how to explode that or how to break that down. But I mean, my question is like really both a question of methods and tools, but and maybe that's more of an observation, but then how do we start to stitch together the kind of the urgencies that I think we can identify like across the scales of the project? That's to anyone.
Is this on? Okay, it's on. All right. I actually think Brandy captured it really well in the beginning, because I do think that a lot of it boils down to people and how we consider that, because that is the common denominator across all scales, is at the end it comes down to what it means about us as a collective. And so, I mean, I also felt that, like, for me, it was also difficult when I was trying to think about Texas is urban the right term? Because we have different associations of that. And of course, I live in Europe, where urban is a very different thing. But I think that, you know, at the end of the day, it's really about how we live together, what those conditions would be as a built environment. And so if you think about that as the common denominator, then scaling it up just means to be able to kind of be conscious about the physical that defines these conditions. I don't know if that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to support that. For me, it's in answering these questions, because there's always the questions that come up, but for me, it was how do we get to a place of acknowledging that there is first something to explore, and then get everyone on some kind of common understanding of what that is and how can we come together to solve it, or even if whatever that is to solve, like how do we first, like the acknowledgement piece is so important, because without acknowledgement, it's really hard to get to a place of that there needs to be change of in some framework. So, yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, and I'll pass it on to others. But I think that the other thing that I realized is that, of course, a lot of times we've been looking at the urban from the top down, but what is in fact more interesting, and particularly I would say in the Houston experience of it, is really experiencing it on the ground and understanding that that has a very different way of manifesting itself, and the complexities of that, I think, that I actually find quite fascinating.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one thing to me that's important and links all of these, what we were saying and what you were saying, is the necessity of kind of having some faith in the potential for connections that seem implausible. So be it between two distinct areas or along a path of infrastructure that may seem inhospitable to it. And I think thinking about projects as being always interlinked with a variety of different environments and through different environments that may or may not want to be connected to or through is really critical to the success of anything. You know, at Post we actually initially proposed going under Franklin to connect to the bayou, or going over Franklin to connect down, and I think that kind of thinking in that situation and not letting what seemed to be barriers stand in the way of something is what's critical to kind of making things work at the human level at the end of the day. But.
Yeah, I think I would just echo what everyone said, but I think it's the unique capacity of architecture and designers thinking about urban issues to both kind of help to situate, but also embody the urban through either the design or the visualization or the communication of the identification of an issue that needs to be addressed and things like this. And you know, the urban, I think from the aerial perspective might be amorphous or might be intangible and might not be something to rally behind or digest from a user perspective. But like, I think what we do as designers is we ground it, or we help it to be lived or embodied in some way. And I think we saw that in all of the projects tonight, from you know, the scale of the people to the campus to the building that's being repurposed. I think that was all very, very powerfully like grounding urbanism in a lived experience. Yeah.
So you all have been waiting patiently. I don't know if there's any questions to any of our panelists from the audience. I know there's some microphones that Carla has, so you can be picked up in the room.
Brandy, to kind of pick up on what you said about acknowledgement, and you hinted at the challenges you've faced in the public engagement process with Metro, and these maybe are not unlike processes that everyone has with client relationships, but I wondered if you can talk about urban and the process of engaging the public who may associate that, have a lot of negative associations with that, including from different demographics, different generations, and I wonder if you could kind of talk about that. And
from what perspective? as
I guess I'm
coming
asking.
to
Yeah. So I guess I'm asking how there's a sense of that we're already here, right? We're the fourth biggest city. This, transit, we have to find solutions for mass transit. We've already missed the curve on it in many ways. And so, but it seems to be, and you hinted at that, there's been some challenges with engaging the public successfully on promoting a project like Bus Rapid Transit. And I'm wondering if that's coming from that the people that have been engaged, or maybe there's a lack of voices in the room that feel like they have a lot of negative associations with the type of urban development that Metro or other agencies within the city are promoting.
Yeah. So I feel very passionate about working and kind of amplifying that voice that is public engagement and translating that information to real projects. And so I think historically, like I live in one of the oldest communities in Houston, and they've seen people like me, architects of all backgrounds, come into a community and want their input, want their opinion, and very rarely see their implementation put into real world street projects. And so that frustration and aggravation and, belief in that my input is going to really impact such a transformative project that will happen, that it's on the other side, as a user, because I want to come in from a user's perspective and support them as, you know, the key influencer of a project. And then when there is a public engagement process that doesn't support that effort and you're trying to combat that, and then from the inside, I think my biggest challenge is trying to change a process that's already happening. And so that is probably, you know, how do you kind of put the brakes on a project that's in full motion, and how do you kind of really bring impact and change and get people, meet them where they are, so that they see that design, their data is kind of driven, or the design of corridor is driven by this data that they're giving us. I think from the transit agency and the process that Metro is implementing, it's an antiquated process, you know, but people are really excited about urbanism and urban design and understanding, wanting to be a part of placemaking. So the only thing that I think that we can do in this, you know, full force process that's happening is kind of just bring them in as much as we can, you know, bring them in as much as we can and kind of be present during public engagements. But I want to kind of champion them when I'm there. For instance, earlier today, you know, we were going through engineering plans and they were right there wanting to kind of walk us through what they didn't like and what they liked. But they were more excited to talk about the placemaking of the after, you know, and so that piece is really important. So I try to just kind of showcase that this is a process that's really going to support your vision in any way. And I really will fight for that. So, yeah.
Brandy, I'm glad you raised this issue about people and public engagement. What I've found in my experience is that as architects and engineers and urban designers and planners, we're often more charged with selling than understanding. So developing shared understanding versus pitching an idea and getting people to come along, or finding enough about what they like that you can put enough of it in it to sell what you want to sell, is fundamentally problematic. And when one goes to a definition of what is urban, and for me, it's about the transactions and a platform or an environment for those transactions. And so if we are building these platforms for these transactions, what do we know about those transactions? How just are they in terms of those relationships, whether it's dance or teaching or living someplace or getting from one place to another? And when does transit and mobility building or facility building or campus building really, really become city building? And where are those boundaries and how do you make those happen?
So we did, and I'm talking from a singular perspective, but we implemented a participatory design phase. And it's an extension of the community engagement. And I think that phase that's taking place after our, so University Corridor, if you guys aren't familiar, is a 25-mile corridor that's going to really impact the mobility of Houston. And with that corridor, we've been in kind of a year and a half long community engagement. That community engagement really didn't look into the considerations of, you know, that transactions. And I think this could connect to your question too. You know, how do we pull that preferred look, feel, and activity that people want to see in between spaces and at transit infrastructure? And so this participatory design phase, which is happening after we finalize this preferred alternative route, this participatory design phase kicks off the transaction of understanding what people want to have the University Corridor look, feel, and be. And so I think that's really going to, and it will influence, it was designed to influence the change of transit and mobility and the look of infrastructure, and implementing a regulatory process of urban design and capturing what people want segment by segment. And so that community engagement, not kind of like a generalized effort of saying, yes, there's a huge vision of this corridor, but segment by segment, what is the preferred identity? What is the preferred station kind of amenities, look and feel that we want this to be? And so that transaction of people versus agents, people with agency, will be vital and important, and I think will be a really transformative project that will be studied to understand how urban design and transportation projects kind of fit and work together.
I really like the definition, the platforms for transaction, and it seems like in thinking about a kind of aesthetic quality that we saw across some of the projects, I think in what was like a giant trading floor of a post office, or even, I mean, on Rice campus, Jeanette's like figured out how to get a kind of like warehouse typology somehow, like with the sawtooth roof as a kind of trading floor, a kind of transactional floor. It seems like maybe there's a kind of aesthetic that like, there's like an aesthetic question, I guess, not just a kind of methodological question that might be like underpinning that question of how we start to define an aesthetic that like engages the question of urban in Houston. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Think about that. Well, I think one way it's easier, maybe doing a building, at least like Post, but any building, you know, where to a certain degree you're trying to get out of the way. I mean, you're trying to define features and facilitate certain things to happen, but you're also trying to just create, as you said, a kind of platform for other unimagined things to take place. Whereas I think actually when it comes to trying to anyway, urban design, I think, is trickier actually in terms of the level of definition that's required, and the level of imposition that definition can create.
I mean, I think that to a certain degree, the buildings that we do, and I would say that maybe it's the same for Post as it is for the Rice building at the Kennedy Hall, is that they are in some senses a microcosm of the larger city. And in both cases, I mean, Post is a reuse project, it is a transformation project, but it is trying to negotiate this question between the generic and the specific, right? So there's this very kind of generic swath of structure that is typical of the hinterlands, you could say. But to make it urban, it had to be injected with some specificity. And that's a little bit the case also with the Rice building, is that, you know, we were trying to kind of figure out like what is the system that gives this a certain logic that's generic enough that they could adapt and reuse this space over the years, you know, when the pedagogy changes, when the activities change. But at the same time, that has enough specificity to it that it becomes part of this campus that is placemaking, that is about reinforcing the identity of the place. And so I think that aspect is maybe something which is more urban than the opposite of urban, whatever that may be, you know, like that where you, it's not about the kind of swaths of generic warehouses, but it's this kind of slight tinge. And I think that's what I was trying to capture as well with some of the images that I found of Houston, was that it is very much also this kind of informality of like industrial spaces that are then reappropriated into something else. And I think it's a very particular type of urbanism because there is a specificity to it, but there is also a kind of, you know, thing that we can recognize from other forms.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to thank our panelists. That was, I think, a wonderful trip through like scales all the way to kind of like the global planetary military project of the Department of Defense from our little auditorium and match here in Houston. So Thank you for joining the program. Thank you for coming out to see us, and look more for what's coming up with the RDA next year. Thank you.